Whether the word be preached or read, no saving benefit I gain. From empty sounds or letters dead, unprofitable and all in vain, unless by faith thy word I hear, and see its heavenly character. Unmixed with faith, the scripture gives no comfort, light, or life or light to see, but me in darker darkness leaves and plunged in deeper misery. Overwhelmed with nature's sorest ills, the spirit saves, the letter kills. If God enlighten through his word, I shall my kind enlightener bless. But void and naked of my Lord, what are all verbal promises? Nothing to me till faith divine inspire and speak and make them mine. Jesus, the appropriating grace, 'tis thine on sinners to bestow. Open mine eyes to see thy face, open my heart thyself to know. And then I through thy word obtain sure present and eternal gain. Amen. We're picking back up in Deuteronomy chapter 23. It looks like we might be able to cover three chapters today. Let's go ahead and dive in. He that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. A bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse thee. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Thou shalt not seek their peace nor their prosperity all thy days forever. Thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, for he is thy brother. Thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, because thou wast a stranger in his land. The children that are begotten of them shall enter into the congregation of the Lord in their 3rd generation. When the host goeth forth against thine enemies, then keep thee from every wicked thing. If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness that chanceth him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp, he shall not come within the camp. But it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water, and when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. Thou shalt have a place also without the camp, whither thou shalt go forth abroad. And thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon, and it shall be when thou wilt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. For the Lord thy God walketh in the midst of thy camp, to deliver thee and to give up thine enemies before thee. Therefore shall thy camp be holy, that he see no unclean thing in thee, and turn away from thee. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee even among you in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore, or the price of a dog, into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow, for even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury for money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. When thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it, for the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. But if thou shalt forbear to vow, it shall be no sin in thee. That which is gone out of thy lips thou shalt keep and perform, even a free will offering, according as thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God, which thou hast promised with thy mouth. When thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes, thy fill at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. When thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle into thy neighbor's standing corn. Thus ends the 23rd chapter of Deuteronomy. The way JW divides this up is begins with the section on who are to be excluded, the congregation of, he calls them rulers. Here it's called the congregation of the Lord. So we'll see if he explains that, but that's in verses 1 through 6. And then it talks about an Edomite and an Egyptian not to be abhorred in verses 7 and 8. No uncleanness to be in the camp, verses 9 through 14. Then of servants escaped from their masters, verses 15 and 16. Laws against sodomy and whoredom in verses 17 and 18. Against usury in verses 19 and 20. Against the breach of vows in verses 21 through 23. And the liberty which might be taken in another's field or vineyard in verses 24 or 25. All right, so in verse 1, he talks about he that is wounded in the stones or hath his privy member cut off, saying he shall not enter the congregation. It's a phrase denoting a eunuch. A eunuch is a man without his genitals, either no testicles or penis or both. A eunuch shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. He shall not be admitted to honors and offices either in the church or commonwealth of Israel. And so the congregation of the Lord doth not here signify the body of the people, but the society of elders or rulers of the people. Wonder why he's saying this. Add to this that the Hebrew word kahal generally signifies a congregation or company of men met together, and therefore this cannot so conveniently be meant of all the body of the people, which could never meet in one place, but of the chief rulers, which frequently did so. Nor is it strange that eunuchs are excluded from government, both because such persons are commonly observed to want that courage which is necessary for a governor, because as such persons ordinarily were despicable, so the authority in their hands was likely to be exposed to the same contempt. Man, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not sure any of that's true. My suspicion is that a lot of people would say, hey, that's not fair that a eunuch can't participate in the holy congregation. He's not in control. He didn't cut himself. But the thing is, in Leviticus it states, lepers can't participate in the holy congregation. Women who are menstruating can't participate in the holy congregation. Someone who's touched a dead body, someone who's had, it talks in here about a nocturnal emission. That's when a man has a wet dream. There are a number of circumstances under which a person is discounted from the holy assembly. Does it make any sense to... I don't know why it would make sense here to interpret it the way that he does. Just one second. All right, in verse 2, it talks about the congregation, quote, "A bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord." So there he just says, taking the word as in the former verse. So once again, we go through the whole thing again, but here he doesn't think that a bastard unto the 10th generation can be excluded from the worshiping congregation, only from leadership within the body of Israel. Verse 3, the term forever, quote, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever." This seems to note the perpetuity of this law, that it should be inviolably observed in all succeeding ages. So Wesley's arguing, okay, maybe after the 10th generation they can join in, but we just need to observe this law forever, more than the other laws. I don't know what sense that would make either. I think he's just trying to keep the Bible from being mean. The Bible's mean. Verse 4, "They met you not with bread and water," is talking about the Ammonites and the Moabites. Quote, "Because they met you not with bread and water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam the son of Beor, Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee." These are the reasons why the Israelites should hate Ammonites and Moabites in perpetuity. So when it's talking about meeting them with bread and water in the wilderness, as the manner of those times was to wait and provide for strangers and travelers, which was the more necessary, because in those times and countries there were no public houses of entertainment. Their fault then was unmercifulness to strangers and afflicted persons, which was aggravated both by their relation to the Israelites and being the children of Lot, and by the special kindness of God and of the Israelites to them in not fighting against them. So, nothing wrong with that. I hate that I'm getting more critical as we go along. So if you want to read those accounts, they're in Exodus and Leviticus, I think. Nope, they're in Numbers. I was wrong. They're in Numbers. Verse 6, it says, "Thou shalt not seek their peace," quote, "Thou shalt not seek their peace, nor their prosperity all thy days forever." That is, make no contracts either by marriages or leagues or commerce with them, but rather constantly keep a jealous eye over them as enemies who will watch every opportunity to ensnare or disturb thee. This counsel was now the more necessary because a great part of the Israelites lived beyond Jordan in the borders of those people, and therefore God sets up his wall of partition betwixt them, as well knowing the mischief of bad neighbors and Israel's proneness to receive infection from them. Each particular Israelite is not hereby forbidden to perform any office of humanity to them, but the body of the nation are forbidden all familiar conversation with them. Same critique on my part. I think here it's clear that there's supposed to be ethnic hatred on the part of every individual, and JW just thinks that's too mean, so he kind of relaxes it, saying, okay, there's a communal reluctance to engage, but there's not an individual hatred, and it's just wanting to have space. It's not wanting their hurt. But here, seems kind of hateful. Verse 7, "Thou wast a stranger," quote, "Thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, for he is thy brother. Thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, because thou wast a stranger in his land." JW says, "And you didst receive habitation, protection, and provision from them a long time, which kindness thou must not forget for their following persecution. It is ordinary with men that one injury blots out the remembrance of 20 courtesies. But God doth not deal so with us, nor will he have us to deal so with others, but commands us to forget injuries and to remember kindnesses." So the notion here being it was Joseph who initially went into Egypt, and he did very well there. He worked for Potiphar, and then Potiphar's wife got him in trouble, and he got sent to prison. But there he was exalted into. He was the number 2 in Egypt for some time, and then that's why all of his brothers and his father and all of their families came into Egypt, and they got rich and they did well, and they got a great land to have their cattle in, just a lot of blessings there. And it was only later that the Egyptians turned against them and enslaved them, and so the Lord is saying, you can't let the bad stuff it turned into turn you away from the Egyptians. You should think of the Egyptians fondly. They gave you a lot of good things. It was there that you grew mighty. Things got bad at the end, but that doesn't cancel out the good at the beginning. But then JW turns this into a commentary on just all of us, where we're more inclined to remember the bad than the good. We give more power to the bad than the good. I read an article a couple of years ago saying, pastors do so poorly because, we get compliments, but also people complain at us a lot. And I don't know how they figured this out, or if they did, or they were just pretending. But they said it takes 7 compliments to make up for 1 insult. It takes 7 good observations to make up for a complaint. The darkness just has more power in that way. So here, this turns to a commentary on how intentional we need to be about paying attention to the good and acknowledging the good where there is good to acknowledge. So that's in the case of the Edomites and the Egyptians. That is not in the case of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Those guys can go burn. I'm only joking because the Ammonites and the Moabites are not around today. So let's bash them. Verse 8, in their 3rd generation, quote, the children that are begotten of them, the Egyptian and the Edomite, shall enter into the congregation of the Lord in their 3rd generation. Oh, how gracious. The previous ones, until their 10th generation are past, they can't enter. But, an Edomite or an Egyptian, they can't come into the Holy Assembly in the 1st generation, and their kids really can't come in either. They're still too impure. But that 3rd generation, sure. If they're interbreeding with the Hebrews. All right, supposing their grandfather or great-grandfather turned proselyte, that means you're a convert, and the children continue in that faith received by such ancestors. Okay, so it's the ethnicity and religion are not the same thing, but they overlap big time, not just in the Bible, but today. So that's the distinction he's making. They're ethnically of those things, but they still have to convert to being Jews. All right, verse 9, the phrase, keep from every wicked thing. Quote, when the host goeth forth against thine enemies, then keep thee from every wicked thing. JW says, then especially take heed, because that is a time of confusion and licentiousness, when the laws of God and man cannot be heard for the noise of arms. Because the success of thy arms depends upon God's blessing, which wicked men have no reason to expect, and because thou dost carry thy life in thy hand, and therefore hast need to be well prepared for death and judgment. So there's kind of 2 different things here. One is an acknowledgement that whenever life is tumultuous, that's when we forget Christ's primary claim on us. So you'll find a lot of people who enter into a time of emergency and say, I'll think about my walk with God later. Right now I've got to take care of other stuff, So you'll have like parents whose kids are in a bunch of sports leagues and their marriage is rocky or something. And they say, you know what, I just don't have time to come to the Lord and be joining in the life of faith. I just have other priorities right now. I'm too busy. I'll come when life is less busy. What the Lord is saying here is you got to make righteousness a priority. It's got to be your number 1 priority, so that no matter what tumult happens in your life, even if it's a war, even if you're going to war, you realize that holiness and righteousness are the most important thing. So as the host, as the army of Israel is traveling, they could make excuses and say, hey, it's wartime, we'll focus on God after we won the battle. But then here, the second part is, it's only through the Lord that you're going to win any battles. It's the Lord who blesses. It's the Lord who gives every good gift. So it makes no sense to try and earn good things in your life without the Lord, because it's the Lord who gives them. So even if you win a battle, you won't even be able to glorify God correctly because you weren't walking in his ways. He wasn't blessing you because of your faithfulness. He was blessing you because it fulfills some other purpose. And there's a big difference between the two. There are a lot of people who are blessed in this life materially, or with a great family, or a great job, but they haven't been walking with the Lord all the way. So they might look at their estate and think, oh, God must like me. No, he doesn't like you. He's not happy with you. He's not blessing the work of your hands because of something good that you're doing. He just sees fit to do so for other reasons. If nothing more than the Lord sends rain on the good and bad alike. But prosperity, that's where prosperity gospel is way off, thinking that you can judge the Lord's affection on someone based on their material blessings or standing. God is no respecter of persons in that way. All right, verse 13, the word cover. Quote, "And thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon, and it shall be when thou wilt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee." The explanation here is to prevent the annoyance of ourselves or others, to preserve and exercise modesty and natural honesty, and principally that by such outward rites they might be inured to the great reverence of the divine majesty, and the greater caution to avoid all real and moral uncleanness. So the basic instruction here, the words aren't altogether clear, but the instruction is that whenever everybody is all together encamped and people need to poop, when they poop, on their weapon they're going to have a little digger, a little shovel, and you need to dig a hole and poop in it and cover it up. And here he's saying we're doing that out of consideration for your neighbor who no longer needs to step on your poop, and then to exercise modesty, because nobody needs to be seeing your genitals. And then by being pure, he's saying it directs our minds to God's majesty. There's not necessarily a notion that God himself cares about whether or not there's exposed poop in the camp. Whereas the notion here does suggest to me that the Lord actually does care if people are just sitting around. And the reason I say this, it's also connected to, in the worship of the Lord, it was filled with good smells. They burned incense, and then they had a barbecue. I mean, anytime you find people trying to appease the Lord, there are good smells. Poop is a bad smell, It's not just offensive to look at, it's offensive to smell. And to have a whole camp full of people just whether they find a big place to put their poop or they're just pooping in little alleys. Most I've read in several different places that most ancient towns and cities like this, they just had human refuse all over their towns. It was only a couple hundred years ago whenever people started using decent hygiene. But prior to a couple hundred years ago, there's just human waste everywhere. So here you have not just a ritual purity, but you have like a smell purity that's expected in the camp. And yes, that would have a good effect on the people, but also I think it pleased the Lord. The Lord likes good smells. He doesn't like bad smells. Verse 15, the servant, quote, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee." J.W. says, "Of such as belonged to the Canaanites or other neighboring nations, because if he had lived in remote countries, it is not probable that he would flee so far to avoid his master, or that his master would follow him so far to recover him." For the Canaanites, this sentence was most just because both they and theirs were all forfeited to God and Israel, and whatsoever they enjoyed was by special indulgence. And for the other neighbors, it may seem just also because both masters and servants of these and other nations are unquestionably at the disposal of the Lord, their maker and sovereign ruler. Understand it likewise of such as upon enquiry appear to have been unjustly oppressed by their masters. Now it is not strange if the great God, who hates all tyranny and styles himself the refuge of the oppressed, doth interpose his authority to rescue such persons from their cruel masters. So here the disappointing thing about what J.W. says is there's an assumption that he's making that if a slave runs away from their master, you can hold on to that slave only if they belonged to a non-Hebrew. If they belong to a Canaanite or another neighboring nation. And I think the reason he assumes this is because in other scriptures, including in Deuteronomy, we've made provision for Hebrews to own slaves. So it's been something. Well, that's why there's the year of Jubilee when slaves are released. So here what I assumed is if there's a fellow Hebrew who's an oppressive slave master and their slave runs away, yeah, don't send him back to an oppressive slave master. So in that sense, there would be an acknowledgement. Chattel slavery is the treating humans like they are no better than animals or property. But this would be a distinction between chattel slavery where humans are not property. If they run away from a master, well, they still have some free will. They can finish their service somewhere else. So it's not that they are someone's property like an ox. A couple chapters ago, we heard if your neighbor's ox gets away and you find the ox, then you have to give it back when they come to reclaim it. You have to take it back if you know who it belongs to. Here, it's just different. If a human escapes, then no, you're not under obligation to take the slave back. And it doesn't seem to me that you're obligated if they come to reclaim the slave. You're not obligated to give it back. So, whatever. We don't have slavery anymore today. Except we still kind of do. But whatever. Not in the same way. All right, so in verse 17, it talks about whores. That's a bad word today. It wasn't a bad word back in the day, but no whore. Verse 17, quote, "There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel." J.W. says, no common prostitute, such as were tolerated and encouraged by the Gentiles and used even in their religious worship. Not that such practices were allowed to the strangers among them, as is evident from many scriptures and reasons, but that it was in a peculiar manner and upon special reasons forbidden to them, as being much more odious in them than in strangers. Okay, so it's not like prostitutes in any part of Israel were tolerated, even if they were not Israelites or Hebrew women. They still weren't welcome. It's just it was especially offensive and scandalous if a Hebrew woman would be a prostitute, because the Hebrews are God's preferred people. They're His chosen nation, His special people. So it's understandable if a Gentile woman might want to sell her body, but why on earth would one of God's women want to do that? And it's similarly today. It's one thing when a non-Christian, a pagan, behaves in a certain way. It's kind of scandalous when Christians behave in the same way as non-believers. Verse 18, the hire of a whore, quote, "Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow." What's that mean? J.W. says, this is opposed to the practice of the Gentiles, who allowed both such persons and oblations they made out of their infamous gains. And some of them kept lewd women who prostituted themselves in the temples to the honor of their false gods, and offered part of their profit to them. I think all it's saying here, well, let's do or the price of a dog. It seems to mean of a whoremonger or sodomite. Such are called dogs in Revelation 22:15. And it is not improbable that they are called so here. From these God would not accept any offering. So in two places now it talks about prostitutes and gay men. And there's not a clear separation between men and women who have sex for money versus are just sexually licentious. It's not making, because all you have to, there's such a thing as male and female temple prostitutes in other religions of this day. So it's saying in other religions, you can hire male and female prostitutes to come in and participate in sacred rites and vows. It's saying absolutely not. Not for the Hebrews. No bueno ever. Never. Okay. Verse 19. The price of a dog. Jeez. Okay. Verse 19. The phrase is, thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother. Quote, thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Okay, JW says to an Israelite. When it says to thy brother, it means to an Israelite. They held their estates immediately from God, who, while he distinguished them from other people, might have ordered, had he pleased, that they should have all things in common. But instead of that, and in token of their joint interest in the good land he had given them, he only appointed them, as there was occasion, to lend to one another without interest. This among them would be little or no loss to the lender, because their land was so divided, their estates so settled, and there was so little a merchandise among them, that it was seldom or never they had occasion to borrow any great sums, but only for the subsistence of their family and some uncommon emergence. But they might lend to a stranger upon usury, who was supposed to live by trade, and therefore got by what he borrowed, in which case 'tis just the lender should share in the gain. This usury therefore is not oppressive, for they might not oppress a stranger. He's quoting another scripture there, I think. You know, this is one of those sticky things. It's funny to me that he starts off with, like, God could have just told them not to have any private property and just share everything between them. And which he could have, you know, why that came up. He says instead he just apportioned a bunch of land to individual people for individual property. And then he makes an economic argument that lending to a neighbor really wouldn't put you out that much because hardly anybody had anything. But then here it makes a distinction between Hebrews and non-Hebrews. It says you can lend, usury, if you don't know this, is interest. You can lend something to somebody on interest if they are not in the covenant with God with you. If they're not part of the covenant people, yeah, go ahead and make a profit. If they are faithful, it doesn't say faithful. If they are a member of your covenant with God, then no, you can't profit off them at all. No usury whatsoever. No interest whatsoever. There are some people who try to argue today that any usury, any interest is a sin. It's not really the case. So, but yeah, for someone you're in covenant with, yeah, that if someone wants to argue that it's wrong to lend money, for one Christian to lend money to another Christian and expect interest back, that's a sin, you could make that case, I think. I mean, you make whatever case you want to, but that makes more sense to me. All right, verse 21, the phrase not slack, quote, when thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it. JW says, don't delay, because delays may make them both unable to pay it and unwilling to. I took out a loan in seminary that I don't know if I paid back. And I need to figure that out. I need to do it. It's not the same thing as making a vow to the Lord, but, you know, I signed a contract. But that's a whole other thing Jesus talks about, swearing vows. He says, don't do it. And it's reinforced in the book of James. Verse 23, a free will offering. Quote, that which is gone out of thy lips thou shalt keep and perform, even a free will offering, according as thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God. JW says, free will offering, which though thou didst really make, yet being made, thou art no longer free, but obliged to perform it. So a free will offering is not one that's required, but it's one that you just want to give out of the bounty of your abundance and your gratefulness to God. One might make a vow in the midst of a free will offering that then they want to recant because, hey, I didn't even have to offer that offering. I was just doing that out of a good thing, so it doesn't really count. He's saying, yeah, it counts. You know, if it's a vow, it's a vow. Don't, you know. There's an episode of Seinfeld where Kramer makes a bet with Jerry, and then he loses. He realizes he's going to lose, and instead of paying up, he just says, bets off. You know, bets off. No good reason for it. There wasn't any foul play, but people are like that. You know, they'll start something, they'll make a commitment to something, but then it's harder than they thought, or they just don't want to do it anymore, and they just go, People today in general, I preached on this. People's word isn't good for hardly anything anymore. People in general only come through on their commitments to me maybe a quarter of the time. I've had to learn to just not care. The last verse is at thy pleasure. Quote, that's in verse 24. When thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes thy fill at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. At thy pleasure, J.W. says, which was allowed in those parts because of the great plenty and fruitfulness of the vines there. The inference there is it's not really okay to do this when there's not a lot on the vines. And the Bible doesn't say that, but you can assume that, I guess. I don't know. You're a jerk if you eat whenever there's not enough. But the next chapter is chapter 24. Listen again to the word of God. When a man hath taken a wife, and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and sendeth her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband which sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after that she is defiled, for that is abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. When a man hath taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war, neither shall he be charged with any business, but he shall be free at home 1 year, and shall cheer up his wife which he hath taken. No man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge, for he taketh a man's life to pledge. If a man be found stealing any of his brethren of the children of Israel, and maketh merchandise of him, or selleth him, then that thief shall die, and thou shalt put evil away from among you. Take heed in the plague of leprosy that thou observe diligently, and do according to all that the priests, the Levites, shall teach you, as I commanded them, so ye shall observe to do. Remember what the Lord thy God did unto Miriam by the way, after that ye were come forth out of Egypt. When thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. Thou shalt stand abroad, and the man to whom thou dost lend shall bring out the pledge abroad unto thee. And if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. In any case thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down, that he may sleep in his own raiment. And bless thee, and it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not oppress a hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. At his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. Thou shalt not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take the widow's raiment to pledge. But thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee thence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. When thou beatest thine olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. When thou gatherest the grapes of thy vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterwards. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. Thus ends chapter 24. J.W. divides it thus. Verses 1 and 4 are on divorce. New married men discharged from war in verse 5. Of pledges, verses 6 and 10 through 13. Of man-stealers, verse 7. Of leprosy, verses 8 and 9. Of daily wages, verses 14 and 15. None to be punished for another's sin, verse 16. And of justice and mercy to the widow, fatherless, and stranger, verses 17 through 22. So the first thing he picks on is in verse 1, some uncleanness. That quote was, when a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her. JW says, some hateful things, some distemper of body or quality of mind not observed before marriage, or some light carriage, as this phrase commonly signifies, but not amounting to adultery. I think carriage here, light carriage, just means like she done him wrong. The second part of that is, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. JW says, this is not a command as some of the Jews understood it, nor an allowance and approbation, but merely a permission of that practice for prevention of greater mischiefs, and this only until the time of Reformation, till the coming of the Messiah, when things were to return to their first institution and purest condition. This is one of these Old Testament passages that Jesus himself addresses. It's on the Sermon on the Mount. He quotes from this portion, and then he says, but I tell you, except in the case of a woman committing adultery, you shall not divorce her. So it doesn't matter if there's been some uncleanness in her. Doesn't matter if she stinks to high heaven. Doesn't matter if she's bitter as all get out. Doesn't matter if you're afraid to come into your home. There is no divorce. This is something that John Wesley himself dealt with when he finally got married. His wife was physically abusive, and neighbors heard her screaming and would see him running out of the house with a clump of his hair in her hand as she came out chasing him. He didn't divorce her, but they didn't live together very much either. So I'm sorry to laugh at that. It's awful. So in verse 4, there's a phrase, may not, quote, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she is defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin. All right, so JW says, this is the punishment of his levity and injustice in putting her away. So the prior verse said, whenever a man has divorced a woman, and that woman goes and she marries another man, it's okay in the sight of God, according to Deuteronomy. It's not okay according to Jesus. But when she gets, if that man, the second husband, divorces her or he dies, the first husband cannot have her back. So say a man, I mean, this does happen. Say a man divorces a woman, she goes and she marries another man, and then it doesn't work out with him, and you start talking again. Oh, that old flame is going again. No, you can't, according to Deuteronomy. So this is the punishment of his levity and injustice in putting her away without sufficient cause, which by this offer he now acknowledgeth. So, yeah, he put her away for a stupid reason the first time, otherwise he wouldn't want her back. He assumes a rational person here. There's a ton, man, there's a dude, no, I can't talk about it. When it talks about how the land shall not be defiled, JW says, not absolutely as if her second marriage were a sin, but with respect to her first husband, to whom she is as a defiled or unclean woman, that is forbidden things. So JW is making clear, if this woman was divorced from the first husband and her second husband dies or he divorces her for some bad reason, she's not unclean, she's not a bad person. However, for her to reunite with the first husband would be unclean. It would be bad. All right. Forbidden are accounted and called unclean in Judges 8 and 7, 8 verse 7, because they may no more be touched or used that are an unclean thing. So she's only unclean to her first husband. She's not unclean to all men. When it says can't defile the land. Thou shalt not cause the land to sin. JW says, thou shalt not suffer such lightness to be practiced, lest the people be polluted and the land defiled and accursed by that means. So as soon as people like modern day Americans look upon marriage as a light thing, something that doesn't bind people for life, something that doesn't have to do with God, then you've polluted the land and it's accursed. Verse 5, the word business, the context is, quote, when a man hath taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war, neither shall he be charged with any business, but he shall be free at home 1 year, and shall cheer up his wife which he hath taken. So he shall not be charged with any business. JW says, any public office or employment which may cause an absence from or neglect of his wife. And then with respect to the 1 year time period, JW says that their affections may be firmly settled, so as there may be no occasions for divorces, for the divorces last mentioned. Yeah. I think of my first year, and I did not cheer my wife up in marriage. She was miserable. She cried almost every day. But that was the year where we figured out how to communicate in the midst of conflict, how to respect each other's boundaries, how to work together, or what things we just can't work together doing. Painting a house, working together in the kitchen, we just can't do that. So, because of that first year and the fact that we were together every day, we have a great marriage now. That might not be exactly what this is saying, but the point being, newlyweds should spend a lot of time together, especially that first year, even if it's miserable. In verse 6, it talks about a millstone, quote, no man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge. JW says, used in their hand mills. Under this, he understands all other things necessary to get a livelihood, the taking away whereof is against the laws both of charity and prudence. Seeing by those things alone, he can be enabled both to subsist and to pay his debts. That was verse 6. The second part of it was, for he taketh a man's life to a pledge. JW says life actually means his livelihood, the necessary support of his life. So the larger meaning here seems to be saying, so a pledge is when someone wants to take money or stuff from you, they can leave a pledge with you, something that's worth something, so that if they don't pay it back, you've got that to liquidate or have for your own. So it's like saying to my neighbor, hey, could I borrow $1,000? Here's my car in case I never pay it back to you. Here it's saying, okay, well, whatever pledge you take, if you're going to lend to somebody, it can't be the source of their income. So like taking a poor person's car is just a terrible thing to do, because that's their only way, unless they work around the block, a car is the only way you get to work. So this is one of those things that can be applied today very easily. Don't take another person's livelihood. Don't do it. Verse 10, thou shalt not go in. Quote, when thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. JW says, to prevent both the poor man's reproach by having his wants exposed, and the creditor's greediness, which might be occasioned by the sight of something which he desired, and the debtor could not spare. So the notion here is, someone's borrowed money from you, you can't go in their house to get paid. You can't go in and look around at their poverty. You can't go around and say, okay, well, you don't have my money, how about I take this instead? So this is predatory. If you're going to get paid back, here you go stand outside and they'll bring it out to you when they need it. In verse 11, it talks about a pledge. Quote, thou shalt stand abroad, and the man to whom thou dost lend shall bring out the pledge abroad to thee. Stinking gnat. All right. Verse JW says, he shall choose what pledge he pleases, provided it be sufficient for the purpose. So you're not going in and shaking somebody down. They're coming out to you and offering the pledge they have to offer. In verse 2, there's a phrase, thou shalt not sleep. That's verse 12. Quote, and if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. So JW says you should restore it before nightfall. which intimates that he should take no such thing for pledge without which a man cannot sleep. So someone might want to borrow, I don't know, your lawnmower to mow their lawn for the day, and they'll say, hey, they'll pledge something to you, pledge some money, or their dog, I don't know. But they're a poor person, they don't have much, you don't need to be taking their stuff. If they don't bring your lawnmower back by the end of the day, give their pledge back anyway. They need to work with everything they've got. Verse 13, the phrase, bless thee. Quote, in any case thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down, that he may sleep in his own raiment, and bless thee. Oh yeah, the assumption here is that all he's got is the clothes on his back to borrow whatever he's borrowed from you. Now he's running around naked or in his undies. Well, actually, they didn't have undies back then, but anyway, the second part of that is, and it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. So even though you're giving back the pledge and now he has no incentive to pay you back, you haven't been this rich person holding a poor person's property. JW says, bring down the blessing of God upon thee by his prayers, for though his prayers, if he be not a good man, shall not avail for his own behalf, yet they shall avail for thy benefit. It shall be right, esteemed and accepted by God for a work of righteousness or mercy. It shall be righteousness, yeah. Okay, verse 15, the phrase, at this day, quote, at this day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it. So JW says, at the time appointed, weekly or daily. Okay, you can maybe stretch it out like this. So the modern day people usually get paid bi-weekly. I get paid bi-weekly. Here, at least, it's saying if you've hired a laborer, don't make them wait for their wages. Pay them at the end of the day, every day. They need that money. They don't have a savings account. They don't have a buffer. They need their money right now. Verse 16, the phrase, not put to death. Quote, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. JW says, if the one be free from the guilt of the other's sin, except in those cases where the sovereign Lord of life and death, before whom none is innocent, hath commanded it, as in chapter 8, verses 1 through 18 of this chapter, of this book of Deuteronomy, and Joshua 7, verse 24. For though God does visit the father's sins upon the children, he says so in Exodus 20, verse 5, yet he will not suffer men to do so. So God says that he exacts vengeance upon people's children, but we as humans in our justice system should never do so. That's what JW is saying. In verse 17, it talks about raiment. Quote, thou shalt not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge. JW says, not such as she hath daily and necessary use of as being poor, but this concerns not rich persons, nor superfluous raiment. So JW's saying, hey, there's some rich women who have clothing to spare, and they can use that as pledge if they want to. I think the biblical assumption is that when a woman is a widow, she's not poor, and that if you're not poor, you don't need to offer a pledge for something, unless you're Judah sleeping with a prostitute in Genesis. That's a crazy story. If you haven't read that one, you need to. All right, I say we end our time together. I got another nice message from somebody who's been tuning in and finding it useful. So if anybody's with us, I hope you've been blessed. So God bless you. I'll be back on tomorrow morning. We'll pick back up where we left off. Bye.